traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from here in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples joining us today as well, if there's anyone in the room. My name is John. I'm currently the coordinator for Asia Pacific of Catalyst Now. If this is the first time that you're hearing about Catalyst, we're a global movement for social innovators and social entrepreneurs, basically working together to advance the sustainable development goals and really create collectives and collaboratives where people can come together in a space, learn from one another, and advocate for a specific issue, which is basically the reason why we're here. So we've actually just launched recently the Agri-Food Collaborative in Catalyst. So we're a movement of 6,000 plus social innovators globally. And our Asia Pacific region is also growing more than ever the past few months and years. So I'd like to also acknowledge and thank the leadership of Tripty of Rejuvrth for the leadership really for taking us all in together for this important advocacy. I think, please go to the next slide. Just a couple of housekeeping items. You all know about this. We're all super familiar as Zoom babies. But if you can unmute yourself, mute yourselves. If you're not speaking, please kindly keep it that way so we're not, yeah, so our session will go through smoothly. And Rama, if you can go to the next slide, please. Please kindly also introduce yourselves in the chat. We hope we can do some more networking maybe for the next run. We can just have everyone share what they're doing. But we're unable to do so right now. So feel free to introduce, change your name, put your organization in your name as well as your country where you're joining us from today. As well as put any social media link. Would be happy to connect with one another even after this conversation. So this is a space that's, I guess, gonna be continuing. So this is not definitely ending today. So we'd love to continue engaging and having a conversation and collaborating with everyone. For today's agenda, next slide, please. 2 more slides. So after my bit, we're gonna be hearing from Tripty to speak about why we're all gathered here today and to speak about RAFT APAC, which is the Regional Agri-Food Transitions Network. As mentioned briefly, this is a collaborative ecosystem initiative that we're hoping to build and also, collaborate. It's a collaborative space for everyone. And then we're going to be hearing from Dr. Paul for his keynote address. I think he's already here. And we've invited keynote speakers and panelists to also share their experiences and innovations and insights about how do we move forward. So I guess how Catalyst is different from other organizations. Everyone is a founder, co-founder, social innovators. So we're all doing something. So the question is, how do we collaborate now in a, I guess, higher level to address systems issues and system challenges? So without further ado, I'd like to pass the ball to Tripty.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I just got excited starting on. Welcome, everyone. 30%, nearly a third of what we grow in ASEAN is lost before it even serves its purpose. To solve this, we have to separate food loss from food waste. Upstream, at the farm level, we suffer from massive food loss. Perishables at the first mile due to poor logistics and a lack of cold chain infrastructure. Downstream, in our cities, we suffer from food waste. Singapore has been pushing agri-tech innovation and green capital. We are still seeing major translation errors when deploying these solutions across the ASEAN supply chain. From a bias towards the assumption of the type of solution that might fit well on the ground, to solutions that are expensive and unaffordable to a smallholder farmer. Today is a reality check on how to bridge that gap. This massive disconnect is exactly why we are gathered here today to launch the RAFT network, the Regional Agri-Food Transition Network, an initiative hosted under the Catalyst 2030 APAC banner, we realized that post-harvest loss isn't just an agriculture problem. It's an infrastructure, climate, and financing problem that cannot be solved in silos. Singapore's capital and tech often fail to survive the translation across borders to the ASEAN first mile, where the actual loss happens. RAFT is designed to be a cross-border translator and matchmaker. We are bringing together the three necessary pillars: the ASEAN farming cooperatives who define the ground reality, the tech innovators who build the solutions, and the impact investors and development finance institutions who fund the solutions. Our mandate over the coming months is to take the bottlenecks identified in rooms exactly like this one and form targeted working groups to pilot real cross-border interventions. But before we dissect the solutions, we must understand the true scale of the vulnerability. To set our macro context today, I am incredibly honored to introduce Professor Paul Teng. Professor Teng is a globally recognized authority on food security and agriculture innovation, currently serving as Senior Visiting Fellow at the ICIA's Yusuf Ishaq Institute. With a career spanning academia, international organizations, and the private sector, his research focuses on the vulnerabilities of Southeast Asia's food systems and the critical need for resilient supply chains. He is here to translate these complex systemic risks into actionable frameworks and provide our high-quality reality check. So over to you, Professor Teng.
Well, thank you so much, Tripti, for that kind introduction. I've been in this region for more than 30 years now. And basically, I'm an agricultural scientist, a very humble agricultural scientist who have thumbed through hundreds of rice fields. But what I wanted to share in the next few minutes really are 4 points, which I'll go through each one in sequence. The first really is that in the context of this kind of workshop and the RAFT network, it's very important to situate the discourse on losses and waste in the context of food systems. And I'm always reminded of the famous quote that we attribute to Sonny Verghese, the CEO of Olam, when in 2020 he basically said, today the global food and agriculture system is clearly broken. And the way we produce food is not sustainable. And it's broken because of too many inefficiencies in the system, some of which have been alluded to, and also not being able to meet both needs of sustainability and the food demand by the poor. Now, I was just in Manila last week attending the Asian Development Bank's food system transformation. And it's very obvious, the tide of opinion is really shifting towards the fact that we need to do something to reduce inefficiencies, among which are losses. So that's my first kind of intervention I want to make. Second intervention, I think, is that, we're a community, quite a mixed community here. And I think we need to be very clear about the scope and meaning of terms. I was involved in the 80s and 90s when I was still a overworked, underpaid assistant professor in Minnesota. FAO had a global program on crop loss assessment, which I was party to actually. And that went on for more than 10 years. So that's interesting. So we're actually now revisiting many of these. And that program was mainly pre-harvest losses. So in terms of the discourse we're holding right now, I think it's important to separate clearly pre-harvest versus post-harvest losses. There's been a lot of work done on pre-harvest losses, mainly due to biotic and abiotic causes, pest, diseases, environmental climate, and so on. And surprised me, the consensus figure is that there's also about 30% loss from pre-harvest, okay? Which accounts for a lot of yield gaps. Rice is a classic example. Yield gaps in rice range from 30 to 50%, which is very high. And many of these are considered pre-harvest losses. Then what I think this particular workshop is about, post-harvest losses. Again, FAO has actually, attributed post-harvest losses due to many inappropriate post-harvest management practices, inefficient technologies, and also the lack of understanding of the factors that affect, for example, quality itself. And I'll come to that shortly. Now, UNEP is also very clear. Okay, they kind of distinguish food waste as the decrease in the quantity or quality of food resulting from decisions and actions by retailers, food services, and consumers. So food is wasted mainly, according to UNEP. UNEP is the UN Environment Program, by the way, mainly in households, in the food service sector, and in retail. Now, I think for the purposes of discussion, it's actually quite important to also separate quantity from quality loss. I think that the 30% figure, I think that Tripti quoted, I believe is mainly quantity loss rather than quality. So in Singapore, for example, we have very high quality losses because of our aspirations to have perfect vegetables and perfect fruit, yeah? Now, the FAO data shows very clearly that in developing countries, there's higher loss and less waste. Whereas in developed economies, there's lower loss but higher waste. I guess we can consider Singapore in the second category. I want now to refer you to a very good chapter in the book which I edited and was released in 2024. And the title of the book was Food Security Issues in Asia. And there's a chapter in there by FAO, by Rosa Roll, basically on reducing food loss and waste in food systems. I really would like to refer you to that particular chapter because it runs through a very comprehensive understanding of what FAO has been doing internationally and also nationally. Now, the third point I want to really make in a few minutes is that it's not just enough to consider food loss and waste in the context of food system supply of food, availability of food. Yeah, I think in today's context, climate change, the contribution of the last carbon mile is actually very important. And we know that because of food loss and waste, the amount of, carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalent is actually very high because of that. So I think we need to pay some attention to that. And if you look at Asia, Asia as a region, we produce about half of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, right? Especially the four countries, China, Japan, Indonesia, India. Very high pre and post production CO2 emissions per capita. Okay? So I think, again, it depends on how you want to scope this particular network, whether you in fact want to include the carbon miles in there. Personally, I think you should, because carbon, climate change is such a big issue now in ASEAN. And I say that from experience working with the ASEAN ministers and so on. Now, I also want to share that in 2013, 2014, in fact, FAO, in fact, launched a program called the Regional Safe Food Asia Pacific Campaign. Okay? And the main aim was to reduce food losses along supply chains. Also fight the growing problem of food waste. So this was recognized as long ago as 2014. I'll be very happy to share some of those references, if anybody's interested, yeah? So in that particular kind of campaign, they also stated that the core requirements to tackle food loss reduction in the Asian region, number one is really to build an evidence base. They build evidence base to allow us to make, I would say, evidence-informed decisions on quality, safety, and quantity. Second is the evidence base on actually how to reduce losses in MSMEs, the micro, small, medium enterprises, and so on. And the third, of course, is on how to improve efficiency across supply chains in the region. This is very relevant to our discussion. I'm reminded, and I actually did my PhD on crop loss assessment, by the way, years ago. I'm very reminded of a quote by a very famous American scientist called George Lyman in the early 20th century, where he actually said, if you don't know how much you're losing, how do you know if your remedial interventions are working? It's still a very relevant question today, But having said that, I think we need to move beyond past aspirations, even today's aspirations. It's not just to identify and quantify loss and also come up with solutions. It's also this whole context of how do you make valuable products out of loss. I think that's a new dimension in this particular time, So we come to the whole topic of waste valorization, which is also attracting a lot of attention right now in the ASEAN region. So not just identify, quantify loss and waste, but find ways, reduce this, and additionally, on how to create value from waste to contribute to the food system. And we have a lot of encouraging initiatives now by startups and so on in the ASEAN region. Of course, the most notable, of course, are the black soldier fly, a larvae that we all see, hear about really. So just to close off then, so preventing and reducing food waste is just one step. It's a very important first step, but in the context of waste valorization, that's where rescuing surplus food, the swift consumption, creating value from waste, and so on, those definitely should become core priorities in this. And let me just finish off by saying that this last year, I've been very heavily involved in writing the ASEAN 5-year plan, Food, Agriculture, Forestry Sectoral Plan, 2026-2030, amongst which actually is a big component, in fact, on decarbonization, waste itself, and also finding ways for regenerative agriculture. One of the first trust is regen agriculture. And you and I all know that regen agriculture depends so much too on trying to reduce waste. Yeah. So with that, Tripti, I think I've used up my time. I don't want to take away too much time from the discussion. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And my apologies, I have to run away for another call later on. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed, Tripti, and all the best for the panel. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Professor Tang, for that sobering context. It's really helpful to set the ball in motion to help us navigate through these vulnerabilities and map out where the leaks are actually happening. And we have brought together 4 perspectives representing the entire continuum of the supply chain. So representing the first mile reality is Cherry Etilano, founder and CEO of Agria in the Philippines, who champions regenerative agriculture and empowering women farmers in post-harvest processing. Providing the financing and data perspective is David Chen, CEO of Agri-8. David uses data-driven insights to make smallholder farmers investable, bridging the gap between urban capital and rural realities. Bringing the macro corporate scale, we have Sander Cleavers, Head of Global Sustainability Operations at Olam Agri, whose team recently conducted a massive post-harvest loss baseline study across 11 global supply chains. And finally, bringing the critical developmental finance perspective, joining us from Cambodia, but currently in North America, is Brett Sutton from the ADB Private Sector Operations. Brett focuses heavily on climate resilience in supply chains and supplementing investments with technical assistance for smallholder farmers. Thank you everyone for joining in this panel, and we are now ready to begin this. So maybe Paul has set up the problem statement for us, but to start with, my first question is for you, Cherry, and then David. Could you briefly share a specific story or observation from your time on the field? What does the missing third actually mean to you as part of your work?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tripti and Catalyst Now for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I'm so happy to see you again, Dr. Paul Teng. I'm such an admirer and follower of your work. Amazing statement there. So this is actually like an unusual question, right? A Tuesday afternoon, because this morning I was also at the farm and I just went back home because I don't have signal there. I think the missing third isn't theoretical. I must say it's painfully visible. On the farm itself, especially in the Philippines that, as Mr. Teng was saying, climate change is really disrupting Asia. And in the Philippines, we've been #1 most disaster country in the world in the last 3 years. We're top 1 and we're not happy about it. We're not proud about it, but that's just our situation because we're facing climate change. And I think my friend Brett Sutton here from ADB would really acknowledge that. I remember, one Tuesday afternoon, a small cooperative where farmers had just finished in harvesting beautiful ripe produce. Everything was there, effort, quality, and pride. But, in the afternoon, loss is beginning. No cold storage, no drying facility, no proper sorting or grading. The buyers hadn't arrived yet because maybe they got caught in traffic somewhere else, or the farm to market road was not established, and the sun was so unforgiving. So look at that situation. And that situation is always like the situation I succumb every time I visit our farming communities. My company, Agria Company, and the Agria Foundation work with around 37,000 smallholder farmers across the country. And some of the produce would be lost, before even they're sold. Some would spoil, some would never even leave their farms. And for me, I always come to a realization that the moment between the harvest and the market is that such a big gap, and that's the missing third. And it's not about production, I must say, because the farmers are very hardworking. They produce whatever you need to produce, especially if they're well trained. And somehow our farmers that we work with, they're trained under our farm school because we're transitioning them to sustainable and regenerative farming. And it's not about the demand, because our company, we work with HoReCa, hotel, restaurants, and catering. We couldn't even supply the demand somehow in some days. It's about, I think, everything in between that we have failed to build. You know, that I think the entrepreneurs here, like David Chen, would agree with me. There are just so many broken infrastructures and so broken system. So in that quiet afternoon, I think, Tripti, you see it in the farmers' faces, not lack of effort, but lack of systems that honor their effort. And I feel really sad about it because, you know, like for example, for 27 years in my life working with these farmers, I always wish waking up one day that hopefully their farm to market road is finished. Hopefully they have better infrastructures in their food harvest facility, but it's not yet there. So that's my Tuesday afternoon. I don't want to be going down, you know, your emotions, but that's the reality, I think, at the last mile, and then just giving you an insight.
Thank you, Cherry, for sharing that. David?
I think I could definitely top up the story. Tripti, I want to check, are you able to share an image that I shared with the team?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
May I request share the images?
Thought I'll put some visual, you know, to everyone's head when I talk about this. Let me know when it's up.
Yeah.
Okay. So Tripti and I had a conversation before that, and then she asked me to share a story as well. So I found this photo that I took just last month in Cambodia. I think in many parts of ASEAN, you will still see farmers drying their paddy along the roadside like this, right? And most rice farmers do this because on paper the sun is free. But this is really where the missing third happens when it comes to the rice industry. So on a typical Tuesday afternoon, you imagine a middleman will pull up and he will walk on top of this grain that's being laid out on the road, and then he put like a moisture meter into the grain, and then he say, "No, bad quality. I offer you this is the best price I can offer you." And the farmers just think that, you know what, this price is too low. I deserve more, and therefore he said, "I don't want to sell." And the farmers just want to hold out for a fairer price. But this is where the issue is, because the longer the grains sit under the sun, the more value it loses day by day. Every hour of uneven heating, or sometimes when there's even rain, it causes damage to the grain, right? So by Wednesday, by Thursday, that grain is not premium anymore, because if they wait too long, birds, rodents, and other damages will claim about 10% of the volume, right? But the missing third also happened at the rice mill, because by the time these grains that's been exposed under the sun get sent to the rice mill, the quality is so poor, the head rice rate become very low. So head rice refer to unbroken rice that most consumers in developed market consumes, and head rice sells at much better price than broken rice. So typically, when you dry the rice under the hot sun, your head rice rate is about 30%. But if you put it through a proper mechanical dryer, you can get about 50 to 60%, right? Now, because the millers bought this rice that has been dried under the sun, and because they couldn't get sufficient head rice from these grains, they would always use it to justify lower purchase price to the farmers. So at the end of the day, it's like what Cherry has shared. No one wins, because post-harvest, the value chain is just so broken. Now, coming back to the farmers, ultimately, he ended up selling poor quality grain at lower price. And the worst thing is, if he can't sell, those grains that he produced will never reach the market, and he will end up keeping this poor quality rice to feed himself, right? So in certain sense, the poorest people in the value chains are also the ones consuming the lowest quality food. So when we talk about the missing third, it's really not just about the lost volume, but also about lost revenue and to a certain extent dignity as well, right? So that's actually to today. I took this picture last month, but this is still very, very common in ASEAN, and a lot of farmers are still facing the same challenges. Thank
Thank
you.
you, David. I mean, you and Cherry have already given us a glimpse into how deeper this problem is. and how little we know about it. So my question to you now, Brett, is at ADB, you look closely at climate resilience. We know climate change is projected to reduce, say, rice production by around 10 to 15%. So how does fixing post-harvest loss act as the ultimate climate adaptation strategy?
Well, I would say it's a layer of many different solutions. Like the things David's talking about, if you can improve quality at these stages and reduce the losses at these stages and improve the processing side, that helps offset some of the losses from the farm that are obviously going to happen with climate change, no matter how we help support farmers to, mitigate those risks. I think one thing that's important too is we've seen two speakers here who looked at kind of very specific context, specific supply chains, which they know really well. And so it's very clear in these two situations what the gaps are. But I think one of the problems is that the gaps are different in every supply chain in almost every different country within the region. It's different in different ways. It's the climate is one bit, the farm context is another, the supply chain itself is another, the access to processing is another. So it's really, I don't think there's any blanket solution necessarily. It's like having, people, like David that dive into the details and provide those solutions. I mean, we've worked with clients on trying to develop similar things to what David's doing, where there's finance at the farm level that address the very specific needs of that context and that supply chain. But these things take time and dedicated effort. And most supply chains don't have somebody looking into those details in the depth that we're talking about here. So I think that's another gap that would be these solutions are important, but they need to expand across other supply chains.
Thanks, Brett. I have some more questions on that, but I'll come to that later. But I have a question for you, Sander. Now that you shared that Olam has went out and measured this loss across 11 global supply chains. So when looking at the difference between perishable crops, where losses around 30 to 40%, and staples around 15 to 25%, what was the most alarming field truth that emerged from your baseline data?
Yeah, thank you, Tripti. So we have the luxury to be able to compare the Asian region against other regions because we're operating actually mostly in West Africa when we look at our smallholder systems. And I do actually see a different level of maturity of supply chains in the Asian region as compared to West Africa. So where in West Africa, I think the issues are larger. The adoption of mechanization, good agricultural practices, infrastructure, tools and equipment is much lesser. But also that makes it easier to make a difference, right? So in these supply chains in Africa, we know what to do to address the very high volume losses that we're seeing. In Asia, it's a bit more complex. So we source rice across Thailand, Vietnam, and also India. And we see the losses are not that high, and mostly actually due to the factors that David already mentioned. So the roadside or field side drying, where wind, rodents, and even theft have an influence. This is also to a large extent due to the fact that the knowledge on, or not necessarily knowledge, but mostly the planning and timing of collection and harvesting times is not optimal. So I think that's a very good opportunity for us to improve, to educate our farmers when the optimum time of harvesting is to happen, and to make sure that the supply chain of the pickup of rice is optimized. So I think that's where the largest opportunity lies. Also, in the cases where there's no mechanization yet, that is definitely, it's not, the penetration of mechanization is quite high in our Asian supply chains. And I think it's true for most Asian, at least rice value chains that at least I'm aware of. But where that's lacking, that's definitely a very good factor to reduce harvesting and also post-harvest in terms of threshing and winnowing losses, which are very, very dominant if mechanization is not happening. So I think that would be our main takeaways.
Thank you so much, Sanders, for that. And I'm sure we will dig more deeper into your understanding on different value chains and how they are being treated. I'm moving on to you, Cherry. So Cherry, startups. I remember we had a conversation on that. The solution which is provided to the farmers may or may not be accessible to them in multiple ways. So there is a startups might be building smart IoT sensors, but rural co-ops might not even have a reliable grid power. So you were stressed about the post-harvest facilities must use about using renewable sources and be non-intimidating. So how do we shift from designing for the farmer in an urban lab to designing with the farmer?
Yeah, thank you, Thrifty, again. I really enjoy our discussion about designing, designing for the farmers to designing with farmers. It's just like, don't talk about us without us, don't plan about us without us, right? So most of the time, we plan and provide solutions without really including the farmers in our planning system. And like, for example, in our company, we work with different technology providers because our company is not technology providers, but we work with for example, Dutch technologies, they come to the Philippines, because of technology exchanges. And most of the time, we really bring them to the community so that solution should be participatory, because sometimes, they work with, for example, water systems. They work with truckloads of land. But if you come to the Philippines, these are smallholder farmers, right? That you're dealing with a hectare or half hectare of land. And then some of them design also cold storage that are actually good for big corporations or corporate kind of farming. But if you go for smallholder farming, like for example with us, it's not doable. And I also have seen a lot of IoT devices introduced in areas where even charging a phone is already a daily challenge. And, because of this, farmers will just not use it. It become like an accessory on their farm, not being used, right? So what I mean from designing for farmers to designing with farmers is really making sure that the farmers are consulted. It's co-created with them, right? I mean, as sometimes, we assumed. There's so much trouble when we assumed. I think David could agree with me in this. There's so much trouble when just we assume their situation, right? We need to immerse and live with them. And I remember when I was starting my journey in agribusiness, I really live in a farmer's house for a month just to understand how they utilize their day, what time they go to the farm, how many hours they spend farming. And by doing so, you normally ask the farmer, what slows you down? What are your dreams? Do you have other dreams? Do you know that you have assets in your farm, but we need to convert this into profit, right? And sometimes we also ask the farmers what feels intimidating versus empowering. So when we design solutions, we normally have consultations, but we also ask the farmers, even at Tripti, if consultation could be half a day, 1 day, or 3 days, because there's a cost of participation. Every time we call the farmers together, maybe there's no one watering their plants. Maybe there's no one feeding their cows and their buffaloes, right? Or maybe no one's taking care of their chicken. And then after the consultation, they go back, everything is dead, and that's a total failure. So what we do, part of the consultation, is we mostly visit them, immerse with them, and really sit down and do it on their farm trial, so that it's innovation with the farmers takes very slow, but for me, it's the only most effective solution that we can do. And another one, it needs to be culturally intuitive. I mean, culturally intuitive, because sometimes, like for example, in the Philippines, there are so many international companies would come. And they assume that if it works in America or in Australia or in Europe, it works in the Philippine context. My goodness, it's not working, right? So these are the things that when they come, they feel so frustrated. And I always say them, my gosh, I've been here for 27 years. If you just talk about frustration, I will be the most frustrated. But I think you need to manage your expectation, and you need to start with humility. It means sitting with the farmers and adjusting your solution, because your solution might work with desert, winter and fall. But in Asia, we only have, for example, in the Philippines, you only have wet and very wet, or dry and very dry. So you need to adjust all your components regarding that. So Thrifty, it's really sometimes, a challenge of expectation. And we always go on the loophole of our assumption. But the most powerful one is really co-creation with the farmers. Put it on the farmer's farm and make it like a model farm, so that other farmers, to cease to believe it at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Cherry. That was really enlightening and really pragmatic. I must say, these are the basic rules which probably need to be there while designing. So, David, to you, my question is that the general perception or the reality is that the venture capital loves software, farm management apps, and marketplaces scale cheaply. But stopping rot requires physical hardware like cold storage rooms, which Cherry and you both mentioned, which VCs find too capital intensive. How do we use data to overcome this bias and actually finance the physical infrastructure farmers desperately need?
I was smiling when Cherry was saying, and to start, I want to say that the VCs are wrong. So software doesn't scale cheaply or easily or quickly. In fact, you can do everything that Cherry described just now, and it will still go wrong. I mean, we learned the hard way. Aggregate, we started off designing a software, and we have sincerely done significant amount of farmer engagement. We have done UI UX enhancement that suits their lifestyle. But at the end of the day, what was lacking was there's really no incentive for them to pick up any of this digital software, right? Anything new, anything that require additional effort, what's missing in our ecosystem when we launched our first software was the incentive was not clear. And we were not willing to just pay farmers just to use our software. So we had to find a market mechanism to pay them. So I think by now VC realized that, software doesn't really scale that easily. Specifically to agriculture and to the rice industry, unfortunately, we have both data problem and physics problem, right? So first, let's go back to what I was sharing just now about drying. Most of the Hass rice and paddy, they are relatively stable when it's dry. And I think Sander shared as well that there are quite a fair bit of mechanization around, right? But to solve this post-harvest loss, the bottleneck is actually the mechanical dryer. And without a mechanical dryer, we just get really poor quality and product, and farmers don't get to sell their grains at good price. Now, today, if you walk to a VC and say, would you invest in a mechanical dryer? They will say no, because these dryers are rather capital intensive, and it's not just about the price tag. It's also about the fact that it's fairly low utilization. Because a high quality vertical dryer might sit there and not do anything for 6 months, especially between harvests, right? Typically, it's very active 3 months during the harvesting period. And if you think there are 2 seasons a year, maximum 6 months. So if you look at a traditional investor, that looks like a bad asset. So how do we use data to overcome that bias and unlock some of this infrastructure? As I shared just now, moving away from sun drying to mechanical drying can increase the head rice yield from 30% to 60%. So in this case, the data and the software is not going to dry the grain, but it does provide the transparency needed to prove that value can be created if we invest in this hardware. And when the rice mill has a higher quality product, rightfully, they should have the margin to pay the farmers fairly, rightfully, right? And just now we also talk about coordination. And while yes, the rice the dryer is heavily underutilized, but using various data, harvest data to estimate harvest timing, to consolidate harvest timing, we can actually coordinate multiple cooperatives to share drying hubs more effectively, right? So with good use of data actually we are able to design drying systems that are more utilized rather than the traditional way of just maybe about 6 months in a year. So the bottom line, actually, the reality is we can't use data to replace the hardware. We can use data to improve efficiency and convince people that this hardware are necessary.
Thank you, David. I
Thank you.
completely, and building on your point, David, my question is to you both, Brett and Sander, that about financing the hardware. So the league differs widely depending on what we are growing. So how does the required technical support and infrastructure differ between a staple like rice versus non-staples like, say, coffee or nuts?
Right. So our company is not active in coffee or nuts. We're solely, well, at least for Asia, looking at rice. So I think the infrastructure which is needed, which we spoke about, is quite expensive as compared to many other crops where you can really benefit from a small sprayer or what we call motorized harvester, basically like a handheld lawnmower that helps you to properly harvest, which is like $100 or $150. The equipment which is needed in rice are combine harvesters, or as David mentioned, the mechanical dryers, which are quite expensive, especially if you look at smallholder systems. Smallholders or even co-ops will have trouble getting organized and to jointly buy it, also because of the relatively short lifespan of such equipment. So definitely external funding is needed. For companies like us, it's difficult to really invest for mentioned reasons, right? High capex, short life duration of the equipment, and also we're not a combine company. We're a procurement company, or supply chain manager rather. So yeah, posing the question is easy, finding the answer is rather difficult. So what we've been trying to do in other areas is to empower local entrepreneurs. So basically, we have the data to support like how much loss reduction can you achieve? What is the value of this loss reduction which you're getting? What is the price farmers or co-ops are willing to pay for the service that you can provide? How long will it take you to earn back the investment of any type of equipment? And that is sometimes proving to be efficient. Also, we have a lot of the other enablers, right? We have access to farmer networks, so we can open those up to anyone willing to support our farmers. So that's the type of leverage that we're trying to apply. More creatively, we're also trying to monetize on the potential carbon benefits from the intensity reduction of, for instance, methane. So as you know, the production of rice is associated with a lot of methane emissions. So if you're able to cut down your post-harvest losses, technically the emission intensity, so the emissions associated with 1 kilogram of final product rice will come down because you emit an equal amount, but you have more rice to show for it. So we're sort of trying to pioneer to see if there's any scope 3 implications that we can achieve, or that we can actually monetize and maybe get interest from industry players there. But this is very early stages, so it's not resulting into anything yet. That's a way we're exploring as well.
Thank you, Sander, for sharing that. Brett, your opinion?
Yeah, I might expand on those other commodities a little bit, because I think one thing that's unique to what we're talking about in rice is some of the finance gaps might be lower in some of those other commodities and more based on technical capacity and access to fairly low cost materials. Like we could talk about, staying in Cambodia, we could talk about cashew and how most of the cashew doesn't even get dried in the field right now, which gives farmers like zero leverage over the price they get for those cashews. So things like that. But when you move into coffee and talking about like farm context, like let's take, for example, like PNG, farmers in fairly remote kind of mountainous areas growing coffee, like one of the biggest risks is the post-harvest time frame. where it's hard to get the coffee kind of dry and it's hard to keep it dry. And so when you do like projects in those, just the gap is a little bit of technical understanding, but just bringing some like wood and plastic up so they can dry it reliably, or some cheap like tin roof structures to keep it dry. Just those little improvements in some of those contexts can go a huge way towards making even an individual farm viable, profitable versus loss making continually. And then you can go, staying in coffee, you can go to like Timor-Leste, where the capacity on like wet milling is just not there, and there have been projects that focus on kind of big, expensive wet mills, but they don't really scale in a context like that. So how do we do better, low cost wet milling facilities, and maybe give farmers and farming communities better access to those, but also better ownership over them? They're all kind of different solutions. So it's really understanding the context, I think, here, and the financing needs to be fit to the context. And too often it's kind of the opposite way around. So that's where we need to really focus on what the needs are and how does the finance fix that.
Thank you so much, Brett. Some very important considerations have come out till this point in this conversation, like access to the farmer, understanding of the farmer. I like what Sander mentioned, that if the farmer also understands that post-harvest loss management is essential to and for them as well, like because losing, of course they understand, but I think the conception, getting things into context is really important. We all are benefiting from the data you guys have been sharing so generously, and it is opening our eyes to that the problem is much broader than what we understand here. So moving on, I wanted to so to Brett and David again. Brett, you are familiar with David's work in Cambodia. We have a non-staple blind spot. Like again, I'm bringing you back to the non-staples. We did discuss briefly about agroforestry, how it is underfunded because they aren't viewed strictly as national food security, even though they build climate resilience. So how do we change that perception for investors? And David, how does aggregate data helps validate the risk of these non-staple crops?
Yeah, maybe I'll start really quickly, David, and then you can take on. I think this is one of the biggest gaps, because it's not just these kinds of solutions we're talking about on the harvest, post-harvest side in a lot of the agroforestry areas. It's like the plants are aging, the productivity is declining at the same time, the quality hasn't been improving. And so devising a model like David's done in rice is a little bit harder, because it's more cost intensive to buy saplings and put them in the ground, and the tenor has to be longer. You have to go multi-years. So I think it's really looking at solutions. What do you do to help the financing meet the farmer needs? I think some simple things you can look at is changing kind of your replanting cycles, like doing them longer term, where you're changing out less of the plants per year than traditionally you would. Traditionally in a lot of agroforestry, you change out like a quarter of the farm every year over a 4-year cycle, but that's to fit financing to it, maybe you extend it. And I think extending it also gives you some improved climate resilience, because you're a bit more nimble on your changing of genetics if you need it over time. If you're changing a tenth of your farm every year, then, and you need to change plants, the financing need goes down. It's more consistent, sustainable financing, but also the farmer is more resilient, which should at some point be recognized by finance itself. So, and I think the other thing there, though, is just most banks just have a really hard time understanding farmer risk. And so that's where I think David comes in, and giving them data. So expanding that to agroforestry, we need to be able to give them data, both the farmers and the finance, that these solutions will work, and that investing their money over a longer period of time at a reasonable rate for farmers makes sense. So that's kind of the tough nut to crack in agroforestry, I think. But I'll let David maybe talk about the details a bit more and solutions, maybe, David?
Thanks, Brad. So maybe I need to describe a little bit about what we do in the rice industry. So effectively, we have two separate models. The first model is strictly production linked, because if farmers were to borrow or were to take a loan from the bank, their capability to repay the loan is based on the productivity. So production linked credit is one of the model. The other model, we are exploring the willingness to repay. So there are circumstances where even if someone can produce, but they side sell and they refuse to repay, sometimes out of circumstances, right? So on one side, we are looking at hard quantifiable data that is derived from remote sensing. On the other part, we are looking at more human behavioral data through survey and through different forms of interaction. Now, the logic is this is applicable to everything. But as Brad has shared, when you talk about a non-staple, we really need to break them down into different categories, right? Rice is about 3 to 4 months. So any interaction that we have with the farmers, any data that we need to collect is within the 3 to 4 months. For agroforestry or for other crops, palm, for example, the duration is so much longer. So when you talk about understanding farmers' behavior and correlating some of this behavior to their ability to repay the loan and their willingness to repay the loan, is a whole different model and it's a whole different mindset, right? So logically it works, but as Brad was asking me before, can you do coffee? I say logically yes, but we are not just a software company. We started with rice because I've spent significant amount of time in rice. Therefore, I understand the agronomy, I understand the value chain, and that's how you design a system work around it, right? So you can do it for vegetables, you can do it for fruits. But the bottom line is you need to have subject matter expert to guide the software and the solution development, not the other way around. If you do it the other way around, it's bound to fail.
That's a very important highlight, and we can clearly see the focus on staple and especially rice in the region is pretty high. And probably we need equal investment on the non-staple crops as well, and perishables for those solutions. So my next question to you is to Sander. Yes, Sander, how does the responsibility of financing a more resilient hardware-equipped supply chain fall on the corporate off-takers? How can companies like Olam de-risk the deployment of better infrastructure across their ASEAN networks? I'm taking it from the built-up from David.
Yeah, sure. So I think that builds on the previous answer that I gave. So like I said, we're not a combine or other agricultural equipment company. We're supply chain managers. So we do have a certain interest and also responsibility, but we can't be solely responsible, and we're simply also not able to. But supporting your suppliers or your smallholder systems to become more resilient ultimately also has a business purpose, of course. So it guarantees a steady supply, it guarantees a longevity of the relationship that you have with the farmers, which both are very important. It can help them to create larger yields or larger production volumes, which of course translate to profits for a company as well. So that's the business incentive that I always try to advocate to my businesses. I think it's there's always, of course, a little bit of tension between making margins and earning money and sustainability initiatives and support of your supplying networks. But there's definitely a very strong link there as well. So it's definitely important. How can we de-risk? That's also a very tricky question. I think, again, it was also mentioned before, but the risk of default when you extend loans to smallholder farmers is relatively high, not because of unwillingness, but because of instability of income, of course, under extra pressure because of climate change and other factors. So that's tricky. For us as a company to de-risk is by empowering local entrepreneurs to take part of the responsibility to have financing systems in place which share the costs, or rather, how can I say, distribute the cost over a longer period. So whenever somebody tries to buy a combine, we take part of the sum, and then they have to repay us in a couple of years. So you're not putting the risk directly with the farmer, but with an intermediary who's a little bit more financially stable and a bit more reliable as a counterparty. So you're sort of distributing the risk across multiple levels, I would say. So I think that's some of the things that we're trying, but a definitive answer, unfortunately, I also don't have.
Completely. I mean, this the problem is there are multiple dimensions to this problem, and while I'm hearing all of you together in the room, we can visualize it that we can't be intervening from one, but we have to bring together a cross-sectional solutions for these. Cherry, there is one more question which I want to ask from you on. Like, I'm taking a little different turn on it. This is the International Year of Women Farmers. So we know women do the majority of post-harvest processing. So how vital is the role of women in stepping in to manage these localized value addition centers to prevent loss at the source?
Yeah, thank you, Tripti. I think my answer would also answer the question a while ago of Jelena from Australia on what happens when there's too much produce on the farm. I think the women are the silent heroes, fixing things that are broken in edges or if everything is at awry. So most of the time, these women that we work with, currently we have around 1,080 women in our network, and we form them into associations and cooperatives. So we call it Women Food Producer Association, and actually this year we want to make it into a huge national cooperative of women, of course in support of the UN celebration of International Women's Month. But more than that, it's because they really help in saving a food loss on the farm itself. They are the ones really making sure that if there are too much tomatoes, they're bottled and preserved, right? If there are too much mangoes, it becomes a mango jam, and we also sell it. And this is something that very important for us, and a lot of people actually is not seeing it, but there's so much limitation also, Tripti. It's because I would connect to David. Even if there are some technologies provided to this community, sometimes access to finance for them is such a problem. Like, for example, if they want to have access to finance to buy solar dryer or mechanical dryer for their produce or processing, right? So this is really something that we've been doing a whole lot since more than a decade ago. We've been fighting for women to be included in the land title in agrarian reform in the Philippines, because when the land title was released, it's always named after their husband. And when they go to the bank or microfinancing centers, and if these microfinancing centers or banks would get collateral, they need to go to their husband to ask permission because their name is not in the land title. So it inhibits a lot of possibilities for these women to really make sure that they could go further in their processing centers, and it could really deliver value addition. And I also realized in all this work, empowering them is not actually optional, it is strategic. When women manage this value addition centers, food loss decreases, value addition increases, and they're very creative. They produce a lot. And actually early this year, our board, and as we launch Nanay to Nanay Grocery, Nanay to Nanay means mothers to mothers. We're connecting mothers, rural farmers, to mothers in big companies. We launched it with Makati Business Club with 400 companies in there. All top C-level women, CEOs and vice president are supporting it. It's because they really see that these women turn tomatoes into jams and magnificent products or dried products, right? So this is really something that it's not only helping their household, but also dignifying, these women on the rural farms that for too long, they feel like left behind. And lastly, I always believe that, we don't need to introduce women in agriculture. We need to finally see them, invest in them, and trust them with a system they've been sustaining for far too long.
Thank you so much, Cherry. I completely agree with you and resonate with you on that. And I think before we move ahead, there is one question which we haven't addressed, which is on farmers switching to regenerative soil methods. Paul addressed that under the ASEAN Secretariat, the focus is on regenerative soil methods. What is everybody's experience? And this question is for the entire panel. What is your experience of working on the field? How difficult it is? Is it possible? How slow or fast are we moving towards regenerative agriculture? And are we already seeing those benefits on the ground? Cherry, would you like to
Sir,
go
yeah,
first?
I would love to answer that because I think I totally agree with the comments in the chat. The future is cooperative. You know, if there's economies of scale, then there's a force to really, put the government on hold and how to support in making it happen. Provide financial institutions to also introduce finance for transition. Because if there's no financing for transition, then transition is totally difficult and it will not happen. And of course, we've been lobbying here in the Philippine government actually for the past 5 years to introduce biofertilizer or better and sustainable fertilizers in subsidies to farmers, because if all of us, and there's a demand, for example, Olam or big companies would demand for regenerative source products, but then your government subsidies are purely not supporting that alone, that's a danger zone and we're not meeting that demand. So for the last 3 years, we've been really pushing for where are those biofertilizers that we could introduce to farmers, so that there's also an economies of scale when the government would approve percentage. Like for example, in the country, they approve already 20% of subsidies to farmers into pushing for sustainable and now regenerative agriculture, right? And second one, that's tangible thing that we're doing, it's because we cluster the farmers into associations and cooperatives. More banks are actually seeing economies of scale. Now this is business. When it's just one farmer with 1 hectare, you're negligible, you're nothing. But when this economies of scale, putting together 100 farmers with a total of 100 hectares minimum, it's economies of scale for financial institutions. And we're also working it out with financial institutions on how to really fuel this transition in terms of financial mechanism. Thank you, Tripti.
Thank you, Cherry. Brett, would you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record again and say it's really context specific. But I agree that like government has a big role in this. A lot of the models on the regenerative agriculture do require a fair amount of technical upskilling or changing, maybe I should say, rather than upskilling. We've done a number of these projects in different places, and there's some really positive bright spots, and there's some what I would call learning examples. I think the things that work best, in my experience, are where there is a strong kind of extension presence that's dedicated towards exclusively the regenerative side. Coupled, that can be from government. You can look at like Andhra Pradesh, where they've done really high-level extension services in transition and seen really fantastic results. But we've done more models where the extension comes from kind of a private sector that's linked to the farmers, but it works best when there are government policies or sometimes subsidies that get things like vermicompost off the ground. So there's on the farm production of some of these inputs. There are models we've done in India where the on-field production of things like vermicompost, biopesticides, things like this in communities has completely offset the need for conventional fertilizers and really reduced chemical needs on pest control, even in like cotton, where pink bollworm is usually you need some chemical control. And the farmers in those contexts where you can make it just a pure profitability play, there's huge interest in the programs. So it's again finding the right solutions, accessing the right government supports where they're in place like that, where you can get like your first vermicompost bin for free and then see the value. And then we've seen farmers go and buy a second or a third. So, there's some farmers, this is in Maharashtra, where they're producing almost 3 tons of vermicompost every, few months here. And that's completely replaced conventional fertilizer needs. But it's because they saw the cost benefits, but they also saw the quality. So in that perspective, that was a cotton project, but they do crop rotations because of the pest pressures. And the big benefits that farmers saw was the quality of the watermelons they would grow. So, there's all these understanding the context of different drivers, how to, once you get the project off the ground and running, what the hooks are that have gotten the farmers that are really interested in it, and how to kind of drive the project that way so that, you get more uptake. I think that's why these things are difficult, though, is it takes time and it takes some diligence and it takes some effort and it takes money on the extension side on these. So, it's again, putting all the puzzle pieces together is important.
Completely agree, Brett. I see that David wants to share something really good.
Yeah, so actually, in a strange way, the global situation and the conflict is actually creating a situation where pushing for regenerative agriculture seems like a necessity at this point in time. I think on the ground, over the last 2 weeks, urea price has already gone up by 20%. And the nitrogen gap is going to be very real, and nitrogen is critical for plant growth, right? So we've seen that some of the farmers who were previously trained by NGOs in regenerative agriculture are now, considering picking it up again, looking at cover crops, looking at compost, looking at biochar, etc. So while global situation is not too pleasant, but it's actually a good opportunity for us to really push on regenerative agriculture, not because of climate reason, not because of sustainability, but simply from a point of cost. And cost of production is actually one of the critical driving factors to behavioral change on the ground, right? Because farmers might not even be able to afford your typical NPK anymore. Yeah. So it's not a matter of whether they're convinced. Moving forward, it might be more of a situation where there's no choice but to go that way.
Thanks, David. Sandra, would you like to comment on that?
I don't think I necessarily have much to add here. No,
Yeah.
I
All
think
right.
most was said.
Thank you, everyone. I can see that we have a very engaging audience who has posted a lot of questions, so I won't be keeping you away from that questions. I will try and cover as many as we can, but I do have one last question for the panelists before we open the floor for question and answers. And as you please keep your answer brief for a minute, and then we can go on to the question and answers. So the mandate of the RAFT network is to build this bridge across the ASEAN supply chain. It's a big mandate. We will narrow down as we go further. And so my request to the panelists is that if you have to design one specific cross-border pilots project right now, one targeted intervention to plug a physical leak, what would it be? Like, what would you suggest, that where should the energies be consolidated?
So if I can go first here, I have many that come to mind, but one that I would be very interested in trying, it's something that has to an extent already been launched in our palm operations in Africa, is a app for farmers, which basically solves the issue which I spoke about earlier, where farmers do not know exactly what is the best time for harvesting, and also the logistics in the pickup of their produce is not arranged very well. So if there's sort of an app that coordinates like the crop calendar with logistical service pickup and truck support, that would be something that I think it requires a bit of investment at first, but I then think the scaling is very easy, right? It's just an app that you download, and it would not need much more than that. And I think it would really solve a lot of losses.
Thanks, Ed. Brett, would you want to go next?
Yeah, no, I think what Sandra said is very valuable for a number of reasons, because if you can use it, if you can leverage it in that way, then you can also use that kind of same app to guide climate adaptation and improving productivity in places where there's a gap. But I don't know that I have a silver bullet of sorts to solve the problem. I think, for instance, we've talked a little bit about rice in Cambodia, and I'd mentioned earlier coffee in PNG. I think the solutions are completely different. So I think for the majority on rice, from my perspective, it's like the things David's talking about and just access to mills in some places. But for coffee, it's really, supply chain, just being strong enough to make sure the coffee reaches its end, that there's an access to supply chain, and that really that on-farm harvest post-harvest, which is a completely different kind of solution. So yeah, sorry to not have a more blanket answer to the question.
If I may add, I think the common denominator and staple in Asia is rice. And my company, we work with 51 cooperatives of rice farmers in the Philippines, and together with PhilRice. And what we're trying to crack currently is to really make sure the farmers has a mechanical rice dryer facility, because it's really critical. That's where the point of the quality of rice suffers when there's no mechanical rice dryer facility on the farm. Of course, they will put it on the road, right? And trucks would crush them. But aside from that, the quality really diminished like in 2 to 3 days. So for me, it's not highfalutin, high science kind of solution, but I think if you just focus on that one simple solution, it could trigger to a more, high quality rice and benefits to farmers. And of course, consumers will also get the benefit of that.
I have the privilege to be the last one. I would like to address the speaker. So for tender and bread, whatever you describe is already doable. So we should definitely have a chat. Cherry, I think I wanted to say there needs to be some policy in play here, because there are certain circumstances where some farmers refuse to send their rice to mechanical dryer because despite having better drying techniques, they're not getting paid a premium. So to them, it's just like additional costs without the additional revenue. So my ask actually is slightly softer. I think it's more of an advocacy and a marketing. I think Prof. Teng and both Prof. Teng and Cherry touched on it briefly just now. I think the concept of ugly food, because as shared, right, most of the consumers in developed nations, they like full grain, they like full rice, unbroken rice. But honestly, if I put two bowls of rice in front of you, one has a 5% broken rate, one with a 15 or 20% broken rate, most consumer will not be able to tell the difference because the nutritional content is exactly the same. So why is this important? Because if we start to embrace ugly food, it also means that we have less wastage, we throw away less. Rice specifically means that the mills could also sell the entire product at a slightly better price, and they would have better ways to provide farmers with more margin. So some advocacy on ugly food is really, really important. I think that will really cause a dent in this whole food loss conundrum that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Before I open the floor for question and answers, may I just request, I know the Rejuvrth team wanted to take a photograph, so maybe we take a picture of the panelists first, John, and then probably open up for everyone. Roma, are we ready for the photograph? For the screenshot?
Yes, we have done it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So the floor is now open for question and answers. I'm ready to take my first question. And meanwhile, I will be browsing through the chat room for the other questions which everybody has asked. But if someone wants to ask in person, please go ahead. Okay, in that case, maybe I'll just pick up the questions which I have here. Okay, I'm going to go start with Gauri had a question on the role of cooperatives to help with reducing wastage, and also the grip hold the Tenguluk or middleman has on farmer produce, and how this affects price, sale, and sustainability. Cherry, would you like to address that?
The role of
And
cooperative.
yeah, the role of cooperatives to help with reducing wastage,
Oh,
and also the grip hold by Tengulak. I'm sorry, I might be speaking the name wrong. On farmers' produce.
yeah,
And
definitely. I think I would answer on the role of cooperative because we work a lot with cooperatives both on fresh produce, vegetables, and fruits, as well as rice. Not as big as Olam or not as big as Sanders work. But because of this microcosm of work, the role of cooperative is really rich as economies of scale because we, for example, we supply, the cafeteria of Google, JP Morgan, American Express, and these are really like big cafeterias, right? With 18,000, 20,000 employees. And if we will just not work with cooperative, it's not manageable at all because currently we're feeding 60,000 people daily, 5 times a day in these cafeterias. And it means having that economies of scale, you can really get traction on committing to private institutions for your supply. You can also get traction from financial institutions to really fund the farmers' operations and production, as well as the logistics cost you can manage. Because we realized before when we're working individually with farmers, it's so difficult to like send your truck and gather in their farms. But if they have like a consolidated center in their co-op, it was easy. And another one, governance is better. So when these cooperatives has better governance, they can also access funding from banks so that they could plant whatever we needed. And at the same time, they could also get crop insurance. So that's really like, for me, the role of cooperative. And lastly, because of certain policies in the Philippines, right, that all the farmers now should be in a national registration center and registry, and they need to be part of a cooperative as part of this national clustering program. So it's also pretty easy when you approach the government for support for the farmers, for example, Farm to Market Road. It kind of like give you a lever because they're a co-op, they have a voice, and they're legally registered as well. So those are my insights.
Thank you, Cherry, for that. David, I have a question for you. Are there any off-takers for the rice grains of lower quality to use it to create rice snacks, rice milk, and potentially as feed for livestock?
So I was sharing just now, this actually goes back to the concept of ugly food. The reality is yes. I think the entire grain, other than the initial 20% you lose as moisture, they are all sellable. It's just that broken rice sell at much lower price, right? Some interesting experience we encountered when we were selling rice was we were selling broken rice to a producer of a rice noodle. But we were asked to polish our broken rice because they want the white noodle as pure and as white as possible. But frankly, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to us, right? So they're all valuable. You can sell the entire thing. But if we don't change our eating habits, then those secondary products or slightly defective product will always fetch lower price.
Completely agree, David, that we as society probably are very obsessed with or we despise ugly food, but there is a whole lot discussion about how the mindset and the shift has to happen to be able to look at food as a source of nourishment rather than just as a sort of like it has to look good, it has to be good to eat. And probably that's one question we haven't addressed in our discussion about how food loss is also impacting the nutrition. So the post harvest loss and the post-harvest subjection to climate extremities is creating a lack of nutrition in the crops itself. So, Brett, would love to hear from you, and if any one of the panelists would like to speak on that.
Sorry, once more there. I missed that. I'm having a bit of an internet problem at the
We were
moment.
talking about that, how the post-harvest subject or to extreme climate conditions is also impacting the nutrition of the food, and overall the food harvest loss is also a nutrition loss in some ways. And we haven't addressed that as a question, so I was hoping to hear from the panelists on that.
Yeah, I mean, on the nutrition loss, there's multiple kind of reasons for that. Obviously, we've talked about post-harvest degradation of quality, but I mean, you've got like the CO2 fertilization issues, and where even in places where you're producing more, you're getting less on the nutrition side. I think that ties back into the things we've touched on earlier, like regenerative agriculture and a more complete like nutritional base for crops to kind of offset some of those losses, hopefully, even though I would say the science is not really well established on how bad the losses from like the CO2 fertilization would be and how much they can be mitigated by that. But to me, it kind of makes sense as a solution we should be already looking at. Yeah, I think those are kind of the things I think a lot of it is at the production level and at the harvest post-harvest processing levels.
True. Thank you, Brett. I can see Cherry wants to add something. So yes, Cherry.
Yeah, may I add to David? I really love the advocacy on agri-food, right? Like even in our supply chain, we always bring the chefs to meet the farmers so that they know that when the procurement guys are not accepting our produce because it's a little bend, it's a little tier, right? Because we're really mostly into sustainable agriculture and now more into regenerative agriculture. So at one point, you really need to educate the people who are receiving it in restaurants, in hotels, in catering. Because last time I really got a bit confused because we got an order of a ton of lettuce, and that lettuce has no spray. Unlike other producers, they soak it in formalin and all the other synthetic insecticides, right? So there's just a little hole, and they refused the entire batch of 1 ton. And so what happened is I really fought a little bit back and brought the entire operation team of our clients, inviting them to go to the farm. So part of the advocacy is really educating them. It's because when you bring them to the farm and they see the practices and they see the ways that it will go, it contribute to care and compassion, that we cannot just refuse the entire batch or refuse this little this batch of leaf because of a little hole, right? We're always looking for perfection, but I would agree with David that it's the same nutritious food. It's the same nutrition no matter there's a hole, right? And then another one, going back to Brett as well, is really more on what we put on the soil, right? All the more, of course, there's no scientific evidence yet fully published on if you go for regenerative agriculture, if your potato or your cabbage will be as healthier because of the thing that you're putting in. So if that's pretty established, maybe it could really put scientific evidence, explanation on why to transition to regenerative agriculture on the production side.
Thank you so much, Cherry. I have a question from Holly here. Holly, would you like to ask the question, or should I read it out from here?
Can you hear me in this headphone?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. When I call from my phone, I think the microphone goes onto the other headphone. So I just needed to check. Yeah, so the context to my question is that I run an impact investing community in Singapore, and we recently had a meetup themed food security, and actually it didn't gain as much traction as I thought, and I was quite surprised why like people in the community that always talk about food security didn't show up. And we had a big discussion about language and why people didn't resonate with the term food security, but they're in agriculture, they're in gender equality, they're in financial inclusion. So given the awesome panel that we have today, I was curious what your thoughts were. Why agriculture is a great hot topic and easy to build investment funds around, but why is food security less catchy and more of a secondary layer of impact? You see any barriers? You see anything that you think needs to change in order for that to happen? Yeah, whatever speaks to you in my ramble, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I think for us, food security is actually quite a big topic, and it can be looked at from two ways if you look at the post-harvest loss reduction perspective, right? So one, if you're reducing losses in a rice value chain, obviously there's more rice that can be consumed and hence will stimulate food security. But also, if you look from the smallholder's perspective, the fact that he loses less of his produce and hence his livelihood, he or she can buy more food, nutritious foods, different types of foods for his household. So I think if you look at it from both angles, it has a very strong food security perspective to it. And we're really trying to focus on that, not only through the reduction of losses, but also through other projects. So what we do is a lot of kitchen gardens where we educate people and also empower them by providing inputs and seeds and seedlings and such to like stimulate local consumption of nutritious foods. We also do poultry projects where we teach farmers on how to commercially grow chickens, sell them to boost protein consumption in communities as well. So it's definitely on our agenda. Yeah, I do think investment is more difficult because it doesn't necessarily have a very strong profit angle to it, right? So I think the only angle that you can go through is the reduction of, or like the reduction of losses leading to the improvement of volumes, and of course, more volumes means more revenue, but you're not necessarily selling anything extra. So I think that makes it a bit more difficult.
I might add a little bit to that too. I think it's such a multi-layered thing. I'm really glad that Sanders mentioned the on the farm perspective, because I think at least a lot of I hear a lot of focus at like country level food security and less talk on what contributes to like rural food security. And that's, again, we're getting back to kind of farm profitability and access to, the right kinds of foods. And then you hear even less a little bit, it feels like, about functional food security and what the nutritional content and access to healthy foods are. So yeah, I think the return is a big part on the private sector side of why you don't see a lot of talk about it. It's hard. It's not an easy topic to align directly to any individual investment, I think. And I think when you get to, we're increasingly blurring the lines a little bit between what is food security and what is climate adaptation, because they're the same. They're two sides of the same coin, really. And it feels like it's going a little bit more that way. And so I would say maybe it's time to try and work food security more into the climate adaptation financing angle, because that's an easier thing for, I think, a lot of institutions to understand or value, maybe.
May I add to that? I think, Brett, I don't know if you were in the ADB Food Systems Forum last week, right? I was actually happened to help, conceptualize the forum. And there's so much in the conceptualization, and even in the forum, there's so much discussion on how to make food security sexy for investors and investments. And ADB just put this several billions of dollars, right? First time in history, the largest investment of Asian Development Bank. And it's really quite difficult to frame it as such, because of course in Asia we have so much climate problems on on climate, right? So that we need to do adaptation and resiliency all together. So what everyone is actually trying to do to make it really palatable to not only development banks, but also to private banking institutions is to really marry the climate adaptation angle and food security and nutrition security. I actually shared an article I just wrote for South China Morning Post that it's really necessary to connect all this, because when food security and nutrition security are all connected together with a climate angle, there's a way that private sector would bite into it, because everyone now is being measured by their ESG, measurement. Even in their investors, they're measured by how much carbon credit and and footprint you have and things like that. So everything is kind of like measured on the aspect of climate. So there's so much discussion on that, but I think we still need to put ourselves together on how to really make food security sexy for investors.
Thank you, Cherry. I think you're closing at the right note. And thank you so much to all the panelists for such an engaging and enlightening discussion. We cannot solve regional food security and waste in silos. We have to address the entire continuum, from the ASEAN cooperatives to the urban off-taker, prioritizing solutions and localized finance. So thank you. A big round of applause for this panel to bring forth all the essential components which are required to put together for a holistic solution. So the goal of RAFT is to take these identified bottlenecks and form targeted working groups to pilot these exact cross-border solutions between now and November. Thank you to our incredible panelists once again for this reality check, and call to people who are interested to be part of this network. Please join us, and let's take this forward from here. Thank you once again to all the panelists. I have really appreciate you taking your time off and speaking to us. Thank you once again. Thank you to the wonderful audience who have been engaged. Stay engaged. Look out for the Catalyst Network and Rejuvrth, and we will be hosting our next talk in May. So stay tuned for that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We can
Thanks,
just request
everyone.
everyone to open your camera before we all go. If you're able to open your camera, please do, so we can take a photo. If not, that's all fine as well. Okay, giving everyone a few seconds. It's lovely to see everyone behind the camera, as always. Okay, taking the photo. 1, 2. One more. 1, 2. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tripti.
Yeah,
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Chen.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Bye.
the team also for putting it all together.